I still remember sitting in the back corner of a crowded classroom when I was 16, staring at a test paper that felt heavier than it should have. The room smelled faintly of dust and old books, and around me, students were laughing, comparing answers, already moving on with their day. I wasn't looking at my score because I didn't need to. I already knew what it was. A few seats ahead of me sat a classmate who always seemed to glide through everything effortlessly. He rarely looked stressed. He rarely stayed after school. Yet every time results came back, his name was near the top. Mine wasn't. I had spent weeks preparing for that exam. Late nights, early mornings, notebooks filled with highlighted pages and handwritten notes. I had sacrificed weekends, skipped outings, and convinced myself that effort would eventually close the gap. Instead, the gap seemed wider than ever. As everyone packed their bags, I sat there wondering what I was doing wrong. At that age, I believed life worked like the stories people love to tell. Work hard, stay disciplined, refuse to quit, and eventually things would fall into place. But reality was beginning to introduce itself to me. Some people seemed to understand things faster. Some people learned naturally what took me days to grasp. No matter how hard I pushed, there always appeared to be someone ahead. Years later, that feeling followed me into adulthood. My first job wasn't glamorous. I spent long days doing repetitive work, learning skills nobody noticed, and trying to prove myself. Every morning I arrived early. Every evening I stayed late. I volunteered for difficult assignments because I believed effort would eventually be rewarded. One afternoon, my manager announced that a promotion was available. I wasn't the only candidate, but I quietly hoped I had earned a chance. For months I imagined what it would feel like to finally move forward. When the decision came, someone else got the position. He had joined the company much later than I had. He was talented, no question about it, but what hurt wasn't losing. What hurt was realizing how much I had invested emotionally in the outcome. That evening, I walked home under a gray sky that threatened rain. The city was loud around me, but I barely noticed. I kept replaying the announcement in my head. I thought about the extra hours, the weekends spent working, the projects I had carried when others didn't want them. By the time I reached my apartment, frustration had settled into my chest like a stone. I sat in the dark for a long time without turning on the lights. Over the next few years, similar experiences accumulated. A friend started a business and succeeded almost immediately. Another seemed to find opportunities wherever he went. Someone else purchased a home while I was still trying to save enough money for a down payment. Social media made everything worse. Every scroll felt like evidence that everyone else was moving forward while I remained stuck. I didn't resent those people. Most of them worked hard and deserved their success. But comparison has a way of turning admiration into discouragement if you're not careful. The more I compared my life to theirs, the more exhausted I became. I started questioning whether persistence actually mattered. Maybe some people were simply born with advantages that others would never have. Maybe effort wasn't enough. Maybe I was chasing something I would never catch. Around that time, I joined a local gym. Initially, it had nothing to do with self-improvement. I simply needed somewhere to release stress. Every evening after work, I would show up, put on headphones, and focus on the next set, the next repetition, the next hour. Over time, I became familiar with the regulars. There was one man I noticed often. He wasn't particularly strong compared to some of the others. He wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the youngest. In fact, he rarely attracted attention at all. Yet every single day, he appeared. Rain or sunshine, holidays or weekends, he arrived, trained quietly, and left. One evening I saw him sitting alone near the lockers after a workout. We exchanged a few words, and eventually conversation became routine. Over several months, I learned pieces of his story. Years earlier he had suffered a serious injury that doctors believed would permanently limit his mobility. Recovery had been slow and painful. Progress came in tiny increments. Some days he could barely notice improvement. Yet he continued. Not because he expected extraordinary results, not because he thought he would become exceptional. He continued because quitting felt worse than struggling. Quitting felt worse than struggling. Around the same time, another disappointment arrived. A project I had invested nearly a year into collapsed unexpectedly. Plans changed. Budgets disappeared. The opportunity vanished almost overnight. I remember sitting at my desk after receiving the news, staring blankly at my computer screen. It felt as though someone had erased months of effort with a single conversation. Driving home that evening, I seriously considered giving up on several goals I had been pursuing for years. I was tired. Not physically tired, spiritually tired. Tired of feeling behind. Tired of measuring progress and finding it insufficient. Tired of believing I was getting closer, only to discover the finish line had moved again. That weekend I skipped the gym. Then I skipped another day. Eventually a week passed. One evening my phone buzzed with a message from the man I had met there. It wasn't motivational. It wasn't profound. It simply said, "Haven't seen you lately. Hope you're okay." The next day I returned. As I walked in, he nodded and went back to his workout. Nothing more. No lecture. No questions. Just consistency. Over the following months, I began noticing something I had overlooked for years. Progress rarely arrived dramatically. It arrived quietly. The people I admired most weren't necessarily the most gifted. They were often the ones who kept showing up after disappointment. The friend whose business succeeded had actually failed multiple times beforehand. Another person I envied had spent years dealing with setbacks I never knew about. Everyone's life looked simpler from the outside. The more I learned about people, the more I realized how incomplete comparisons really were. I also began changing the way I measured myself. Instead of asking whether I was ahead of someone else, I started asking whether I was handling difficulties better than I had before. Could I recover from setbacks faster? Could I remain committed when results were invisible? Could I continue moving, even when motivation disappeared? Those questions gradually mattered more than rankings, promotions, or recognition. Then came a moment I still think about today. Several years after losing that promotion, another opportunity opened unexpectedly. By then, I was older and far less emotionally attached to outcomes. I applied, prepared, and did my best. When the decision arrived, I got the position. For a brief moment, I felt excited. Then something surprising happened. The victory didn't feel as important as I had imagined years earlier. What mattered more was realizing how many times I had almost quit before reaching that moment. If I had walked away after one disappointment, or two, or five, I never would have been there. The promotion itself improved my circumstances, but it wasn't the most meaningful part of the experience. The meaningful part was understanding that persistence had changed me. It had made me more patient, more resilient, less dependent on immediate results. Looking back, I can still remember that teenager staring at a disappointing test score. I can still remember the frustration of watching others advance faster than I did. I can still remember evenings spent wondering why effort seemed to produce so little. Those feelings were real. The unfairness felt real too. Some people do begin life with advantages. Some opportunities arrive unevenly. Some journeys are undeniably harder than others. I no longer pretend otherwise. But I also know something else now. The moments that shaped me most were not the victories. They were the periods when continuing felt unreasonable. They were the mornings when I showed up despite discouragement. The evenings when nobody noticed my effort. The seasons when progress was invisible. Years have passed since then. I still encounter people who seem more talented, more successful, or luckier than I am. The difference is that I no longer view their success as evidence of my failure. I simply see different paths. Some are faster, some are smoother. Some begin much farther ahead. Mine has never been the easiest route. But it is mine. And whenever life knocks me down now, I think about all the earlier versions of myself who wanted to stop, but didn't. The student who kept studying, the employee who kept working, the exhausted person who returned to the gym after disappearing for a week. None of them knew how things would turn out. They only knew the next step was still possible, and strangely enough, that became enough. These days, when setbacks arrive, I don't ask whether life is being fair. I don't ask whether someone else has it easier. I simply focus on the next thing that needs to be done. Because somewhere along the way, I learned that strength isn't always found in winning. Sometimes it's found in refusing to stay down. Sometimes it's found in quietly returning the next day, carrying your disappointments with you, and continuing anyway. And when I look back at the hardest periods of my life, the memory that stays with me isn't the pain of falling behind. It's the realization that every time I thought I was finished, there was still a small part of me willing to stand up one more time and say, "Not yet. I'm still going."